Can I post take questions 1 and questions 100 together? That's not 1 to 100, it's 1 and 100. I established an implementation group on Seanad reform to consider the Manning report and to develop specific proposals to legislate for Seanad reform. The implementation group comprises members of the Oireachtas with the assistance of outside experts as appropriate. Since its initial meeting on the 9th of May, the group has met on 11 occasions and is expected to make a report in the coming weeks.
And thank you for your answer, Taoiseach. What I want to ask is, in relation to the Seanad Reform Implementation Group, I understand its work is due to conclude next week. I understood they were to sign off on a proposed bill to give effect to the recommendations of the Manning report, and that legislation is then to be sent to you. So what happens next in the process? Will you accept the group's bill? And I'm aware that the Taoiseach had some reservations around the Manning report. When will we see a bill before the Dáil? When will we see legislative changes? This is like a long-running saga in Irish political life, the issue around the Seanads, to have or not to have, and then the reform of it. You know, there's people out there, in fact, maybe there's people in here who don't really believe that this is ever going to happen. And I think we need to allay those concerns. I think people voted for the retention of a bicameral system on the understanding that it would be a reformed system. And I think it is only right that we honour that expectation of the people. The last thing we need is anything that contributes to further cynicism in respect of political life, or more importantly, the institutions of lawmaking and government.
I think I was recently at an event marking the contribution of Eamon de Valera to Irish parliamentary tradition, and I think in fairness to Eamon de Valera, he did a lot of work in reforming the Seanad and indeed in including it and giving it constitutional provision in the 1937 Constitution. And more than that, he removed from the Dáil, the then Dáil, the right to change the Constitution by itself, which was a remarkable giving up of power for the period in the 1930s, or at any time for that matter. So I think that's where we are in this context, and I think it is time for significant reform of the Seanad today. I'm glad that the Minister for Transport's personal veto against the nominee for chair of the Implementation Committee was eventually lifted and the committee was able to get on with its work. And I think, in passing, Taoiseach, you might comment as to whether this highly unusual situation where an independent member of government can personally block a parliamentary majority's wishes is one which you continue to tolerate on such matters. That was shocking. In terms of, it seems the committee is doing good work. It's coming to a conclusion. And given that the government is considering referendums next year on divorce and other matters, I'm curious as to why the Seanad isn't featuring in those plans, because it seems to me that an outline is ready, that a legislative template is almost ready. My understanding is the committee has to meet and sign off on it, and maybe the Taoiseach can encourage these members to attend and to be constructive in relation to what's on the agenda. But I think the timescale exists, Taoiseach, and I'd ask you, would you agree, for producing legislation relating to the Seanad, which could lead to a constitutional amendment? Wouldn't, I apologise, it wouldn't lead to a constitutional amendment. That could lead to a change in terms of the make-up of the Seanad, how it's selected, and so on like that. And I don't know whether the Attorney General's office has looked at what the committee is looking at. I think it seems to be politically more realistic, maybe, than the Manning report in terms of the phasing in of some of the, these would be legislative proposals, of course, the phasing in of change that it might cover over the next two Dáils and Seanads, or the Oireachtas when they come together. So you might comment. I think there's room for fundamental change within the next 6 months.
Joan Burton. Thank you. I just want to ask the Taoiseach, has the government done anything about the issue of the university seats in terms of the Seanad? There was a referendum about that so long ago. I think a lot of people don't even know there was a referendum, but there's never, in relation to the university seats and opening the franchise to all of the universities and colleges of higher education in Ireland. As I say, that referendum was so long ago, a lot of people are not aware that it ever took place. Is there any proposal by the government in the context of the upcoming general election, which will include Seanad elections, to actually extend the franchise for the Senate to graduates of all of the third level institutions in Ireland?
As I mentioned earlier, the group has now had 11 meetings, and it's meeting under the very able chairmanship of Michael McDowell, former Attorney General and former Taoiseach, known to many of us in this House very well. And it is, of course, an all-party committee. As they haven't issued a report yet, I can't really comment on it. Obviously, once the report is issued, I look forward to reading it and look forward to examining it. The leader of the Seanad, Jerry Buttimer, keeps me up to date on occasion as to what's going on in the committee, but I didn't realise they were quite that close to signing off on a report. I haven't seen a draft report yet or anything like that, if one such exists. I do have some reservations, which I have expressed in the House before. I would like to know what the cost of the election would be. The Constitution requires that Seanad elections be carried out by postal vote and only by postal vote. So a postal vote involving millions of electors and potentially hundreds of thousands outside of the state could be very expensive. But I don't know what that figure is. Perhaps they do. I'm sure that'll be in the report. And also, secondly, I do have some reservations about retaining the different panels as they currently exist. Although I understand that to change that would require a change in the Constitution, and that's not being proposed, because the last iteration of Manning that I saw would require pretty much everyone to register to vote again for the Seanad elections. If we open up the franchise to everyone in the state or every citizen abroad, it would require a registration mechanism by which people would register to vote and would then pick a panel on which they want to vote, whether it's University of Dublin or NUI or Education or Industry and Commerce or Administrative or you name it. And I think that could be quite a confusing exercise for people. People, when they register to vote, tend to register to vote, and they register to vote where they live for their local constituency. Asking people to choose between a number of different panels when they register to vote, I think could cause some confusion. And I also think the panels are out of date. They don't really reflect 21st century society. I think they derive from a papal encyclical in the 1930s, which De Valera was very fond of, sort of Catholic corporatism, and that's where those particular panels arise from. But they're just my reservations. I'm not determining this or running it or seeking to... I don't know, but I think they're legitimate reservations, quite frankly. I think they're legitimate reservations, quite frankly. I would like to know what the cost of a major postal vote election like that would be, and I'd also like to understand why people think that retaining these panels are the optimal way to elect a second chamber, rather than a national list or a regional list or many other different options that could be considered. In terms of the university seats, again, that referendum was passed a long time ago. I think it was the 70s that referendum was perhaps passed, and successive governments and Oireachtas have decided not to make any changes. But I imagine that will all be rolled into whatever reform bill emerges out of this particular process. My own sense on the university seats is that if they didn't already exist, you'd never establish them. But if you look back historically, I think the contribution of the university senators has been enormously positive. And I personally would like to see them retained in some way, perhaps with a third constituency for the newer institutions that aren't included. You could just merge them all into one, but personally I'd like to see NUI retained, University of Dublin retained, and maybe have a new constituency for the more recently established institutions like DCU and UL and some of the ITs. But again, they're just my thoughts. I look forward to receiving the report, and as I say, there are no proposals that I'm aware of for a constitutional amendment in relation to Shannon reform.
Question 2, Taoiseach.